started around 11:02. Virginia Continuum of Care Spending Plan webinar. My name is Anna Blasco, and I'm with the National Alliance to End Homelessness, and I'll be running the Q&A portion of the webinar. Norm Suchar, the Director of the Center for Capacity Building at the National Alliance to End Homelessness, will be leading today's webinar. But before we do that, I wanted to introduce Kathy Robertson, with the Virginia Department of Housing and Community Development. Kathy?
Thanks, Anna, and good morning, everyone. We're delighted today to have with us Anna and Norm from the National Alliance to go through the spending plan and how it works and what it can do for you. As you know, this upcoming year's application for state funding and the federal funding that flows through DHCD, so all DHCD funding associated with homeless services, will be on a COC basis. And so what we're looking for is a community plan. This process will also be, I think, will be beneficial now while you're doing your COC, your HUD application as well. But as I just said, we're going to be looking for a community plan for addressing homelessness. And in order to effectively do that, you really need to look at where all your resources are coming from and where they, where they're going. And so that is the whole. That's what the spending plan will do, as well as you can look at. It will help you to discern how things should change in the, like this year and in the years to come. So with that said, I just want to set the stage for that. Again, we really appreciate the National Alliance doing this for us. So I'm going to turn it back to Anna.
Thank you, Kathy. And if we have questions towards the end of the webinar that we're unable to answer, we might be calling on Kathy again to answer some of those questions as well. So you might hear from her again. So all of the participants on this webinar today will be muted. If you have questions, and we hope you do, you can go ahead and submit them in the questions box you'll see on this graphic here, and we'll answer them at the end of the webinar. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Norm.
Thank you very much, Anna and Kathy. Here's a quick agenda of what we'll be talking about today. I'm going to go do an overview of the spending plan template using some slides that are cut and pasted into the into this PowerPoint slide show. So we'll do that first, and there are a lot of slides, and we'll kind of go through them quickly, but I think it'll make sense. And then we'll switch and do sort of a live demonstration. So I have a copy of the template on my computer, and I'll open it up and we'll type in so you can sort of get a feel for how it works and how things interact. And then we will talk a little bit about different funding strategies and the ways to use the template to advance your goals to prevent and end homelessness in your communities. We will have some time for questions and answers. You can type in questions at any time during the webinar, but we probably won't be answering them until near the end of the webinar. And then we have a couple of additional resources that you can use. So let me start by going through some slides that sort of show what the spending plan template looks like. And I know many of you did this template last year. This year's version of the template is very similar to last year's, and if you have last year's and you'd like to just modify last year's, that will work as well as filling out a new template. So the newer one has just some very minor changes and a couple of bug fixes, But if you have the old one and you think it's largely you don't want to fill out certain parts again, you can go ahead and use that and just update that one, or you can go ahead and input everything into a new template. And I'll show you the web address for where you can get the template off our website a little later. So this screen you're looking at right now is the sort of the introduction and overview of the spending template. There just is a matter of to give you a sense of what these slides are like. A lot of them are just screenshots, and the type is too small to read. You don't have to read this, but I just sort of want to show you what it looks like. So this is the overview and sort of some general instructions about how the template works, but there are instructions embedded in the other parts of the template. The main thing I want to show you is that down at the bottom of the template, there are these tabs. So you can see one that says Overview, and then there are 3 yellow tabs, List, Funding Detail, and Plan Changes, and 3 blue tabs, Funding Summary, Charts, and Organizational Summary. In general, the yellow tabs, well, the yellow tabs are things that you fill in, and the blue tabs are things that just show you information but are not things that you fill in. The way we've constructed this template is that you cannot enter anything into the blue tabbed spreadsheets. If you try to click on it, it just won't let you enter something. If you would like to enter something or change it, you can go ahead and do that by unprotecting those sheets. And there's no password to unprotect them, but in general you probably won't want to, and we just wanted to make sure it's very easy to break things in the spreadsheet, so we wanted to make sure that it was hard to break something. So here you see sort of a blown up version of those tabs, and again, it's the yellow ones are the ones where you enter information, and the blue ones are the ones that just summarize what you've inputted. So we're going to start by looking at the blue tabs first. And this first one is the tab that is the funding summary. And what this shows you, and this is blown up, and it's only sort of a partial shot, so there's more stuff on the right here, but I wanted to make this legible, so we sort of expanded it a little. But what this tab shows you is what kinds of programs you have in your community: shelter, transitional housing, permanent supportive housing, rapid rehousing, etc. And how much is being spent in your COC on each of these strategies, and what the funding source is, and how much is being spent from different funding sources, including Continuum of Care funding, ESG, and others. And so this is a nice breakdown of where funding is coming from. The next tab is the Charts tab, and this just puts summarizes your spending information in chart form, obviously. So the chart on the left shows how funding is allocated currently, so that's the existing bar chart, and then how you're planning to allocate funding 12 months from now, and how you're planning to allocate funding 5 years from now. And it shows those various categories. And then the second chart, Chart 2, Funding Sources, just gives a pie chart breakdown of the various funding sources that are being used to fund homeless assistance in your community. So that's the second summary tab. The last summary tab is an organizational summary. And what this tab does is it summarizes information by organization, including where funding comes from by organization. So I've made up some organizations. I was very creative here: organization A, B, C, D, and F, and how much funding goes into, how much funding each organization uses for homeless assistance, and then this is broken down by funding source generally. Now, one sort of little thing I want to point out right now is that occasionally you will see either green little triangles or red little triangles in some of these boxes. The green triangles generally mean that this is a value that is calculated in some way, or there's some, the value comes from somewhere else. When you see a red triangle, and we'll show you those later, that means that if you hover your cursor over that cell, then it will show you some kind of comments or instructions. And we'll look at how to do that a little later. So this is the organizational summary. So those are the 3 ways that the template summarizes information. Now let's go to look at the places where you enter information. So all those summaries were areas where that summarize information, but first you have to put in the information. And these 3 yellow tabs show how you put in information. So the first tab is just called Lists. And this is just basically where you list various things that will help fill out the rest of the spreadsheet. So the first column is a list of activities. Now this is something you will not be changing. So this is just, you'll just leave that column as is. The second column is a list of funding sources. So you see COC, ESG, HSG, et cetera. And the funding sources are something that you will add information to. So we've listed some of the major funding sources here, but if you have other major funding sources in your community, this may include things like your city or county Department of Housing may have some resources. It's possible you're getting resources from particular foundations that you want to list independently, or some other things like that. Last year when we did this, we had several questions about, funding for organizations come from many different places. There are a lot of individual donors and things like that. So it's important that you just sort of use judgment about what should be listed here and what shouldn't. For example, you obviously wouldn't list each individual donor that an organization has, because that would make the chart a complete mess, and it's really not that useful for planning purposes. But if there is, for example, a major bank that is funding a lot of different types of homeless assistance, and it would be helpful to note that independently in this template, then you would put that in there. So there's no hard and fast rule about when to include things in this list of funding sources. You just have to use your judgment about whether it will help in the long-term planning for the organizations in your continuum of care area. The last column is a column called List of Organizations, and this is where you list all the organizations that are providing some kind of homeless assistance that you're going to include in the template. So this earlier I had put organization A, B, C, D, and F in here, but you would put the actual names of the provider organizations here. So the next tab is, so here, for example, I've added a few different funding sources and a few different organizations. So the stuff in the red circles are things that I've added here. And you'll see where those go on the next tab. So the next tab is called Funding Detail. And the way the Funding Detail tab works is, first of all, I just want to point out that sort of on the right side of this is a sample. So this sort of provides an example of what one of these might look like, but you don't have to do it exactly like that, or it's not that important that it looks precisely like this. But I wanted to, we put that up there to make a couple of points. One is that an organization will have different strategies and different funding sources. So organizations are going to appear numerous times as you're filling out this funding detail tab. So, I just wanted to highlight that in the sample. But the sample is just sort of to give you a sense of what it might look like. Yours will, we'd expect it to look very different. So let's look a little closer at how this is filled out. And I just want to point out a couple things here. One is this tab uses drop-down lists for the name of organization, strategy, and funding source. And the way these drop-down lists work is that if you click on a cell, there's going to be this arrow on the right side, that little gray box with the arrow pointing up and the arrow pointing down. And when you click on that arrow, it's going to give you a list of things you can choose from to fill this out. So it'll list your, when you click on the cell under organization, it'll list the organizations. When you click on the list for strategy, which we've done here, and then click on the arrows, it'll show you a list of the strategies, and you pick the one that fits. And then the same will happen of funding sources. For the funding amount, you'll just have to enter that in. And generally, people have been rounding to the roughly the nearest $1,000. There's no need to, this isn't an accounting program where you have to be absolutely precise. This is just important for planning. So you probably don't plan down to the $25 for your COC. So you wouldn't need that level of specificity and detail. But rounding to the $1,000 is probably a good balance there. So this is what one looks like filled out using the things we've entered. So you can see there all the organizations are in there, the strategies that they're funding, the different funding sources, including the ones we've added, County Funding Source A and Bank Funder A, for example, and the amounts. And so this is the information that you saw later in the summary tabs. It came from here. So I mentioned earlier the triangles, the little red triangles. So if you see a little red triangle and you think you might want more information about that, if you just hover your cursor over that cell, this box will pop up, and it'll have some instruction or something. And this one has an instruction about if you click on a box below and then click on an arrow to choose an organization from the list. One other thing I want to point out here before we get too much further is that this template was created in Microsoft Excel 2010, which is a relatively new version of Microsoft Excel. If you are using one of the older versions of Microsoft Excel, then some of these features don't work the way that I'm describing them now. So if you're using Microsoft Excel 2007 or earlier, then what you will see is the drop-down lists won't work the way they do here. And so instead of using those drop-down lists that I described, what you'll be doing is you'll have to type in the names of organizations and such. You should only have to type any particular organization once, and then it will autofill when you type the first couple letters of that organization, subsequent times. But the drop-down list will not work in earlier versions of Microsoft Excel. So this may be a reason to upgrade if you can, convince your IT department to do that, or it's something that we just wanted you to recognize. So the last place where you enter information is the section on planned changes. So you see I've sort of highlighted the Plan Changes tab, and we're going to zoom in and take a bit of a closer look at this now. So the way the Plan Changes tab works is, first of all, this area that I've circled in red here is what you will be seeing, that will all be filled in for you. So when you filled out the funding summary tab, or sorry, the funding detail tab, you filled out a bunch of stuff, and this adds all that stuff up and sort of aggregates it, and so you have it here. And again, there are some yellow, some red triangles, and you can put your cursor over those to highlight them. For example, if we put our cursor over the scattered site transition in place cell, it would have a description of what that means. So the first part is the summary. Then let's look at the green sections. So the first green column is for new funding. So a couple things here. First of all, this green section is for planning for the next 12 months. So what you'll be doing here is putting in new funding, reallocations of funding, and reduced funding that you expect to happen over the next 12 months. Now, we understand that not all your fiscal years line up exactly, and so what does 12 months mean and things like that. So this is how we're suggesting you fill this this information out. Excuse me. If you are filling this out for 2014, and you have fiscal years that start at various times, if your fiscal year includes January 1st, 2014, then that would be considered current funding. So that you would have filled out in your funding detail tab, for example. So if you have, for example, a fiscal year that starts July 1st, 2013 and goes until June 30th, 2014, that would be considered current funding. Now, if you are planning to change that grant the next time it comes up, maybe it's a COC grant and you're reallocating, or it's a United Way grant and you want to change what it's being used for, then that would be you would consider all of that funding that starts on July 1st, 2014, so next year. All of that funding would be part of this next 12 months section. So hopefully that kind of makes sense. So this new funding area is for areas where you expect to receive new funding or additional funding above and beyond what you're currently receiving in the next 12 months. And I think you should be reasonably sure you're going to get that funding to put it in the spending plan template. If it's very, if you have no idea whether you're going to get it or there's little chance that you'll get it, we suggest that you probably leave it out for the planning purposes. But again, this is a judgment you'll sort of have to make. So this is areas where you have new funding. The next column is for reallocated funding. So in the HUD world, reallocation has a very specific meaning, but this isn't just about COC reallocated funding. This is just about any funding that is currently in your system, but you're planning to use it for something else. And what's very important about this section is that you should have both negatives and positives in this column. So, for example, what's happening here is there is $25,000 that's being reallocated from outreach to homelessness prevention. So you see a negative $25,000 in outreach and a $25,000 in homelessness prevention. And then there's another $100,000 being reallocated from scattered site, not transition in place, transitional housing, to rapid rehousing. And what you see in this column is that the transitional housing number shows up twice because it's on an individual line, and those darker green lines are summaries of different things. So it also shows up there, even though it's really only coming out once. And then it's showing up as a positive under rapid rehousing. And then the last column is reduced funding. And so this is areas where you unfortunately expect to see less funding. And again, you put all those in as negatives because they subtract from the total amount of funding you have available. So that gives you a sense of how to fill this out. And the idea behind this is that the decisions about what's new funding, reallocated, et cetera, should be collaboratively made, and these are community planning decisions. So hopefully there's not, some individual who's responsible for figuring all this stuff out, but that this is, you have meetings, you have discussions about exactly what is going on with funding and how are we going to be proactive and decide what we want funded rather than just sort of trying to jump on whatever funding opportunities are available. And then the last column here just summarizes all the changes you've made. And then there's another set of columns which is for the next 5 years. So this works exactly the same way as the green section on the next 12 months, except, obviously it's describing about what you plan to have happen over the next 5 years. So before we go, I'm going to now switch to trying to do a more or less live version of this. So what should be coming up on your screen in a second, or hopefully it's already come up, is a live version of the spending plan template. And so I'm just going to highlight a couple things here. So as you can see here, this is the overview section. Now, if I go to the various summaries that we had talked about, so here is the funding summary, and if I try to click on some of these, you probably can't see this or hear this, but I am trying to click on these cells, and it won't allow me to click on those cells because this sheet is protected. But you can see nothing's filled out here because we haven't put anything in. These are the charts. The charts aren't constructed because we haven't done anything. And the organizational summary is also blank. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to these yellow tabs. And again, we'll start with our lists tab here. And so this is the first thing we fill out. We go through our list. So we have our list of activities on the left side. We'll leave that one alone. We have our list of funding sources. So we had the original ones, and I've added a few here already: Medicaid, PATH, and Virginia Community Foundation. That's not, as far as I know, not the name of a real foundation, but I wanted to have an example here. And we can go ahead and type in another one as well, and business funder. So we just type that in, and then I've also put in a list of organizations here already. This wasn't on the original sheet, and again, none of these, as far as I know, are the names of real organizations. They're just sort of generic names that we made up for the sake of doing the spreadsheet. And again, we can add additional names of organizations here. So I'll just make a new organization called City Shelter. So those are our lists, and then we go to our funding detail tab. And again, we have our sample over there on the right. We have nothing here on the left so far, and we'll go ahead and fill one in so you can sort of see how it works. So I put my cursor over here, and you can see that box popped up because it has a red triangle on it. And there's this arrow that I can click, and so I click this, and this is something that happens often, which is that the I had this window pop up, sorry about that, which is that it looks like something's blank, but what's really happened is you're scrolled down on the list, and if you scroll up, you'll see the choices there. So if you click on one of those buttons and it ends up blank, try going up a little, and you'll probably see the options there. And so you can see these are the options, including the additional one we've added, the strategy that they fund we can put in here, and let's just put year-round shelter for that one. The funding source, and again, this is another example of where it scrolls down too far. This is something we tried to fix, but couldn't figure out how to do it. But we'll put business funder and an amount. We'll just put in $100,000, and there you see it. Now, what I'm going to do here, just because the thought of you guys watching me input all of these is probably going to be boring, is I have this other spreadsheet where I've already filled out a bunch, and I'm just going to copy and paste those in here right now. So those just came from another. I had set up one previously for this demonstration. So now you can see a filled out funding detail tab. And now let's go over to our blue tab so you can sort of see what this looks like. Our funding summary now has some information in it, probably not as much as you'll have as real communities, but it has information, and you can see the charts are filled out and have some information in them. And then the organizational summary, similarly, shows you these organizations, their total funding, and the sources of funding that they're coming from, including the ones we've added, the business funders, the PATH, Medicaid, although nobody's using Medicaid here. So lastly, let's look at our planned changes tab and just go ahead and make some changes here and see how this works. So let's just hypothetically assume that we're going to get some additional funding for homelessness prevention, and we'll add, say, $50,000 there. And you can see that automatically updates the spending here. And let's say we're going to reallocate some scattered site transitional housing, let's say $200,000. So we'd say minus $200,000 because it's being reallocated from transitional housing, and let's say it's going to rapid rehousing. And so we add $200,000 there. And again, it's updating all of these things. We'll do one more reallocation. Let's say we will reallocate from an employment program, $50,000, to an outreach program of $50,000. And again, you can sort of see how that works. Now, a very important point here, which is that everything that gets put in the 12-month tab will probably have to be put again in the 5-year tab. So you'll notice that these things we put in here for the next 12 months are not already in the next 5 years one. So we'll have to input those again if those things are going to be consistent. The way to think about the 5-year section is that these are changes that are happening over the 5 years, but it is not. You're not looking at the total amount that's being spent over the 5 years. You're looking at annual spending, what you expect your annual spending to be 5 years from now. So these are still going to be annual numbers in all of these sections, but you're projecting forward 5 years. You're not trying to take account of everything that is being spent over those 5 years. So let's say this reallocation here is going to be permanent, and so we put those in both places. And again, with this one, and we will add an additional reallocation here. Let's say that there's also some year-round shelter. Year-round shelter that's being reallocated to permanent supportive housing for whatever reason. Let's also, over the next 5 years, we had our $50,000 here from homelessness prevention. Let's also add a couple new permanent supportive housing projects. So we got lucky and had a large one in new funding, but we lost some funding maybe for our outreach program. It's temporary for some reason, and it's going to be cut. So this sort of gives you a sense of some of the decisions you'll have to make, the conversations you'll have to make. And then we can go again, look at our funding summary tab again. But what you'll notice here in the charts, all these changes we made are reflected in the charts, and you notice that huge increase in permanent supportive housing because we added that very large grant for permanent supportive housing. And our transitional housing reallocation took money out of transitional housing, et cetera. So that gives you a sense of, there's one more thing I just wanted to mention really quickly. There's this extra text back here, and I just want to let you know that it exists, but there's just ignore it. It's not there for any particular purpose. It just helps to fill out the charts to have that data in the background. So that's there, but you can sort of ignore all that text to the right side there. So that gives you a sense of how this looks live. So let's go back to our presentation and talk quickly about some funding strategies and the way to think about how you use this template strategically. In developing the template and in working with partners around Virginia on this, it's very important that this not just be an exercise in paperwork, but this help provide a forum for strategic conversations in communities. One thing we've learned, the National Alliance to End Homelessness works with communities around the country, and one thing we've learned is that being very strategic about how things are funding and being planful about how things are funded is a critical step for making progress in ending homelessness. And if you look at communities that are doing well now, one of the most common things you'll see is that they have either had a spending plan strategy or had some long-term strategy about how they wanted to use funding, and that they were not just taking advantage of funding opportunities as they came up, but they were shaping funding opportunities because they were having conversations among providers, among funders, among political leadership in the community about how funding should be spent in the future and had a long-term vision for how that should happen. And so the idea behind this is not just to fill it out as quickly as possible, but to really use this as a forum for having those strategic conversations, having funders at the table, having your local government agencies at the table, having your political leadership at the table, having providers at the table, and other stakeholders to decide, how do you think homelessness should be funded and what should it look like going forward. And there are a few key things to include in that conversation. And here are 4 of them: populations, goals, interventions, and funding sources. So let's look at populations first. And there are a couple things that are important to look at. I have just filled out this chart here just with, with numbers. This is not representing a specific community, but to give you a sense of some of the things you should pay attention to when you're talking about funding. It's important to look at your major populations. Certainly single adults, families with children, youth are some of the major ones, and to look at people experiencing chronic homelessness, to look at veterans. There's more that should be on this chart, but I didn't want to make it too complicated and hard to read. But domestic violence is another thing that you should look at. It's important to start with, okay, what are the people we're seeing? Who are the people we're seeing over the course of the year, and what are their experiences? So you can adjust your interventions and your funding and your strategies to account for how many people it is that are experiencing those conditions. So what we see in a lot of communities is that, for example, there's a lot of funding for families, but very little for single adults relative to their numbers in the population. Some communities have a lot of funding for youth. Some communities have almost no funding dedicated to youth. So it's important to start the conversation with the people and where those people are. So that's usually the first thing we suggest to people. And this is something that you don't have to do anything special for. You're collecting this data through HMIS, through AHAR, your annual homeless assessment reports, to the degree that you're doing those, and point-in-time counts. It's important to think of your funding strategies related to the goals of your community. Now, these are goals that I've sort of included, and you may have different goals as well, but these are goals that are similar to the ones a lot of communities use. Keeping people off the streets, having a safe place for people fleeing domestic violence, housing people, minimizing the lengths of homeless episodes, etc. So too often what happens is that funding conversations focus on what is currently being funded and how to protect what is currently being funded. And that may or may not be important, but it is that process will be served much better by focusing not on what activities are currently being funded, but what are the goals of homeless assistance and what are we trying to achieve. And to the degree that what is currently being funded is achieving your goals, you're going to have a much better case to make for it in the context of talking about what goals those programs are achieving rather than just talking about maintaining those programs. So starting with populations, talking about what goals you're trying to achieve, and then looking at what interventions are your higher priority interventions in your community. So again, I've identified some here. There are certainly more that you'll be looking at in your community, but it's important to not just focus on having sort of one of everything in your community, but to have a strategic conversation about, okay, what's the highest priority? What do we need most going forward? And it's not enough to have a rapid rehousing program or an employment strategy or something, but connecting it back to those earlier things we talked about. Do we have enough rapid rehousing for all the people who need rapid rehousing in the community? How high is the priority is that, et cetera? And are these, so we've set up some goals. Are these achieving those goals? Are they serving the neediest populations, and are they cost effective? Important questions to ask. And then this is the last thing that I want to talk about today is about thinking about funding sources. And the funding sources conversation, I think, is a very, very important one in the context of the COC application and other conversations you have. Because there are sort of two aspects to the funding conversation in the community. One is that it's certainly important to understand what to fund, but the funding sources for each of those things are also very important. What a lot of people are noticing is that the continuum of care programs are funding more and more housing and fewer services. And so it's important to understand what's happening in those areas, so that, for example, if your COC has a supportive services program, so supportive services only programs are a low priority for HUD funding, but maybe your supportive services only program is something that is critical for some reason in your community, and it is a high priority for funding. So it's important to then have the conversation about, okay, we're hurting ourselves by including that supportive services only project in our COC application, but maybe we can work with funders who make that kind of funding a higher priority and ask them to take up the slack there. So this ends up being a great way to get your other partners in your community engaged in funding discussions, because you're having a sort of a bigger picture funding discussion about what's the role of, say, mainstream housing agencies like the Public Housing Authority in our COC. What's the role of our healthcare department, our other mainstream services, et cetera. So even if something's a high priority, that doesn't necessarily mean it's a high priority for every funding source. So it's important to have those, have a strategy for which partners are going to be funding which types of activities. So just to summarize some of the questions you should be answering for yourself as you're talking about, as you're having these conversations about funding, is funding meeting the needs of your population, so the people who are experiencing homelessness in your community? And is it meeting them to the scale that it needs to meet them? Is funding supporting activities that directly achieve your goals? So the goals, again, are very important, and often what happens is that in a community, when they have these conversations, they find their homeless assistance is actually trying to meet a huge number of different needs in the community. And what happens is that there's a little of everything rather than sort of a lot of activity around achieving the most important goals. So it's important to prioritize those goals and make sure that what is being funded is directly supporting those goals. Are more effective interventions being prioritized? Are you utilizing mainstream funding sources? And then are mainstream partners involved in funding discussions? This is something, as we've worked with other communities around the country, that when you start having these larger funding discussions and inviting those other partners, they can often contribute in ways that you would never have predicted, because they understand their limitations, but also their resources much better, and when they're involved in these discussions and become invested in these discussions, they become much better partners and much more willing to contribute. So that's my presentation. And the next section we're going to go to is the Q&A section. So I'm going to turn things back over to Anna. Anna?
Thanks so much, Norm. So if you have any questions, please feel free to type them in now. I have a couple here I'd like to get started with. First, I just think we need to clarify the webinar is being recorded, and we're going to send the slides and the recording out to all the participants as soon as we can after the webinar is completed. Additionally, I think I'll direct this towards Norm. Should individual providers be completing this spending plan?
So not the whole spending plan. Individual providers are certainly going to have to fill out stuff to contribute to the spending plan, particularly in the funding detail section. But this is not a provider, this is not sort of designed for provider-level strategic planning. That's certainly an important thing to do, but that's not what this exercise is for. So what you'll want to do is to work with your COC lead or whoever in your community is putting together the spending plan template and work with them about precisely what they want you to fill out as a provider. But there will certainly be sections that providers will fill out, particularly around the funding detail. But this is not something that an individual provider would fill out just for their own organization. You could certainly if you want to. There's no restriction on it, but I don't think it would be that beneficial.
And Kathy, if you're still with us, if you could just clarify what the deadline is for the spending plan?
Yeah, the spending plan will be a part of the application. One of the reasons that we wanted to do this earlier versus after the DHCD application had come out is so that it allows you more time to be working on this, plus we thought it would be perhaps helpful during the HUD NOFA process. But the spending plan will be due with the application, which will be due 8 weeks after its release. Its anticipated release is toward the end of January or probably early February, given the HUD application deadline.
Great, thank you. So Norm, if you could talk a little bit more about what funding people should include. For example, if we have an organization in our community who doesn't serve homeless people specifically, but they do, let's say, provide homelessness prevention funds, should they be included?
So this is another area where there's going to have to be some judgment involved, because it's really the line, particularly around homelessness prevention, gets very fuzzy. People will have to use their judgment. If there's an activity that's going on that is really targeted to homelessness prevention, particularly if you're using, DHCD funds or ESG funds, then that would certainly be something you'd want to include in the spending plan template. But then things get a little fuzzy as you, for example, you probably have churches who are doing, providing a lot of different kinds of assistance and services, and money to pay to catch people up on rent or something may be included, and maybe that's homelessness prevention focused, maybe it's not. So I think around the homelessness prevention area, it's a challenge, and I'd encourage you to cast as wide a net as you can, but it can also get a little daunting to try and get all the various different sources included in this effort, and it's important to focus on the strategy and having conversations about how things should work moving forward, and not just on trying to track down every single person who might be providing prevention in the community. So again, there's judgment involved. If you're using ESG funds or DHCD funds, I would certainly say yes. Or if you're using funds from a program that really is targeted to homelessness prevention, then I'd certainly say yes. But there is a point at which you're probably going to want to say no because it becomes too difficult to track down all the various programs that could be out there.
So this question is also for Norm. But Kathy, please feel free to weigh in if you have something to add. There's going to be some changes in the names of funding sources. Also, the application is moving to a COC-based application. Does that count as new funding? Should we call HIP, HPP? Could you explain what constitutes new funding in that regard?
So, the point of the template is to look at real changes in funding. So, I think if you had a program that was called, it was HIP, 1 year and it's, something else the next year, that's not really a change, and I would suggest not doing it in the template that way, although if you wanted to, you certainly could. And you can either, I would suggest sort of going back to the previous, so when something gets a new name, to go back and pretend that it's always had that same name, essentially. So Kathy, you can probably give more specific examples since you guys are sort of have been more involved in that. But if you want to, you certainly could, but I don't think that's necessary, and that's not sort of the point of the template isn't really to capture changes in the names of programs so much as it is actual strategic decisions. So I wouldn't, for example, reallocate funding from HIP to VHS. Did I get that right, Kathy?
Right. Right.
I would just sort of I would probably go back and just pretend it was VHS all along and do it that way. But I don't know, Kathy, if you have thoughts about that.
No, I think that's fine. Again, the point, like you said, Norm, the point is not to ensure that we've got the names correct, but that we're looking at the funding sources correctly. So.
Yeah.
Thank you. Norm, how would you suggest communities encourage their partners to be transparent about what their resources are and what they're used for? It sounds like some people have had trouble with this.
Yeah, I think, and to be fair, there's always a degree in a community where people are sort of competing for resources against each other. So some people don't really like to disclose all their different funding sources and such. But here's what I would say. One thing is that it's important to talk about the purpose of this process. So that everyone understands what this process is about. The goal behind the spending plan template is two things. One, to make sure that you're spending on the most important things, the highest priority things, the things that are going to help you achieve your goals for the most number of people, etc. But it's also going to help you create a case for getting more funding in your community more generally, because you're bringing other funders into this process. So there is a degree to which it's beneficial for providers to participate in this process, and you should communicate that. The other thing, though, is that there's a level of specificity that is necessary and helpful for this, but there's also a level of specificity that's just not that necessary. So who people's individual funders are probably isn't that important, and so you may not need that level of detail for something like this, like if they, people have a benefactor or something like that. That may not be necessary for this purpose if they want to keep those confidential. It's just important that the major categories of funding are correct, the degree to which government sources of funding, which are already public information, those are important to include. So I think these two things, both communicating the purpose of this, but also being reasonable about what kinds of information people should be giving you. I think both those are important strategies for this. But also, I mean, there's a degree to which this is a requirement for state funding, and so the degree to which people are participating is important in this process. And it's also important to communicate that this is this is something that's being required in addition to being something that's helpful.
Thank you. And I just wanted to acknowledge that we only have a few minutes left, but we have some good questions here, so we're going to try and answer as many of these questions as we can, even if that means going a minute or two over the webinar. So Norm, I'd like to ask if you could please clarify the meaning of mainstream resources. That's a term that we use a lot generally, but could you give some examples of what you consider a mainstream resource?
Sure. In general, the distinction between a mainstream and a homeless-specific resource is that the homeless-specific resources only fund homeless assistance, so for people currently experiencing homelessness, whereas mainstream resources generally fund services for low-income people or people at risk or people in poverty, but also can fund things that are like homeless assistance. So that's generally the way you delineate. If it's just for homeless people, then it's a homeless-specific resource. If it's for low-income people generally, then it's a mainstream resource.
Thank you. Norm, could you recommend how to break out services within one specific program, say shelters? For example, should I list shelter employment services separately than other services?
That's a very good question, and it's this again. I keep coming back to that there are some judgment calls involved in this. But the way I would think about this is if you have funding that is really intended to be just for a certain program type, like if your shelter employment services are, you're getting employment funding to do that, then I would break it out separately. But if it's part of your regular services, your regular case management and such, then I would not break it out separately. So again, there's a bit of a judgment call in there, but you want to make distinctions that are going to be useful for planning. So certainly there are case managers that do all kinds of different things, and you're not going to do like time coding and things like that to identify, to break those things out. You just want to you really want to get the big ones and the ones that have dedicated funding. So so that's where I would draw the distinction. Is if you're getting funding just for an employment program and it's employment funding, then I would break it out separately. But if it's just part of the regular services and it's funded as shelter services or something like that, then I would say just consider it part of the regular category, the shelter category in those senses.
Thank you. Could you explain how to handle one-time funding? This person uses the example of capital funds that an organization receives to expand shelter beds, for example.
So that's another great question. I would suggest not putting capital funds in the template, just because it's not that useful. It's just not that useful a distinction for the purpose of the template, which is really more focused on ongoing funding sources and such. And so it's not that it's not capital's obviously important to planning and important to all these programs, but I would not include them in the template. I would sort of keep those separate. There are also other one-time funding sources which you may want to include in the template. HPRP was a great example of that. And in those cases, you just have to fill it out. If you're currently getting it and you're not going to get it next year, then it's included in the funding detail tab, and then you essentially lose that money in when you do the green and blue sections the next 12 months and the next 5 years.
Thank you. We have a question here about including inflation. That is necessary to include or not?
If you're getting inflation adjustments in funding, then you should include those if they're more than the rounding error. If it's just a few $100s, then there's no need to include them because you're rounding to the nearest $1,000. But I wouldn't do it at all for the 12-month one because unless your program is huge, I don't think you're gonna I guess maybe some larger programs will go over that threshold. Or if you're in a place where FMRs are skyrocketing or plummeting, I suppose you'd include those. But the 5-year one, you're probably going to want to do those. And again, we're not economic forecasters, and there's no reason for us to be. So estimates are entirely appropriate. And by estimates, occasionally I mean guesses are entirely appropriate.
I know you covered this a little bit in the webinar, but could you please explain if someone's current fiscal year doesn't match up with the next 12 months, could you recommend a way to handle that?
Sure. I would just say that, so the way we put it in the instructions is to say January 1st is sort of, that means the fiscal year. So if it includes January 1st, it's the current fiscal year. So for example, if you're filling out the template now, and if you're talking about fiscal year that started July 1st, 2013 and ends June 30th, 2014, that is the current fiscal year. So if you want to look, so that would be included in your funding detail tab. If you are talking about the fiscal year that starts July 1st, 2014 and goes to June 30th, 2015, that is the next fiscal year. So that would be included in your next 12 months planning. So I would just use, whenever January 1st is. So again, if your fiscal year started, let's say your fiscal year starts January 1st, 2014, that would be the current year. The fiscal year starting January 1st, 2015 is the next 12 months. If your fiscal year started March 1st, 2013, so it's finishing up in a few months, then that's the current year. But then the next grant that starts March 1st, 2014, that's the next 12 months. So hopefully that's, and actually that's covered pretty well in the instructions in that overview section of the template, so you can kind of look there.
I'm going to ask one more final question, and then we'll end the webinar. Is it necessary or beneficial to include school-based McKinney-Vento program information in the spending plan template?
I believe that it is helpful to include that information. So, that funding is a little can be a little different because the boundaries don't work, and you're actually going to experience this quite a bit. Is not every funding source is COC based. So, again, I keep coming back to judgments. You'll have to make judgments about that, but that is actually a helpful funding source to talk about and to include in the template. Yes.
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you, everyone, for participating in the webinar today.
And before we just finish up, this last slide has our email address and the web address for the template on our website. Now, we'll be sending out these slides, so you don't have to, if you're furiously writing it down now, you don't have to, because you'll be getting this in your email shortly. But just wanted to let you know that if you have any questions, you can email the Alliance at thecenter@naeh.org, and we'll be sending out the link to the actual spending plan template as well. So thank you, everybody, and enjoy